Okay, so I'd like to continue talking today about everyday life koan. I talked last week about this, and those of you who weren't here, that's okay. You'll pick it up, soon enough. I think you'll pick up the drift of what I'm getting at with this subject. So what I want to do with this talking about everyday life koan is to give you an orientation about how to practice in everyday life. Okay, and I mean really practice at the deepest level. We usually have some kind of thinking that we're doing our deep kind of Zen work on the cushion, and then we go and we're applying it off the cushion. And there's some truth to that, but it can give us a little. It can really incent us in the wrong way. It can orient us in the wrong way around how the opportunities for really deepening in everyday life. Okay? So when you're not on the cushion, don't think about the cushion. When you're immersed in activity and engagement and in work and conversation, family, that's your practice entirely, 100%. So any sort of idea, and this happens all the time, that, oh, I wish I were as calm as I were on the cushion, or I wish I were clear right now, that actually causes problems. That's actually not helpful. That's like kind of the practice going a little bit sideways. Right? The real practice is completely being present with whatever's coming up. And if that means you're activated, then that's part of it. There's wisdom in whatever activation is coming up for you. That's the Dharma. That's the doorway. So I'm going to talk about this because that's the koan. Koan, koan it manifests as a gap. Right? The traditional kind of understanding of koan is that it presents a situation which is normally an encounter between a master and a student, or two masters sometimes, where something unexpected is presented. The master answers the question in a very counterintuitive way, or I should say a logical way, in an illogical way. And so this kind of gap opens up, like, what's going on here, right? And we practice with these situations by putting ourselves into the situation presented by the koan to see, well, what is the issue? What's the problem? Right? But the way to use the koan as breakthroughs into deeper levels of consciousness is to fully experience that confusion, to fully experience the gap, to fully experience whatever emotions come up in that situation. Anger, fear, heartbreak, sadness. Those become the dharmas. Those become the gateways. So please leave all thought of, I need to be calmer behind. Zen is not about becoming calmer. It's about becoming more present. So these gaps arise between the world as the world as it is, and the world that we want it to be, the world as we want it to be, right? How many times a day does that arise? Right. A gap arises between the world as it is and the world as we understand it to be. What's going on there? Why is that happening? I don't get it. Okay? And then another version of that first one is the world as it is and the world as we think it should be. Right? There's that. So all sorts of emotions get activated when, our ideologies or ideas or our beliefs around, how things should be is come up against reality. And what arises in that gap. And then there's the root gap. that Zen is, particularly directed towards, which is the gap between who you think you are and who you really are. So the first gap tends to generate, this is the world as it is and the world as you want it to be. When that gap opens up, we often feel anger or anxiety, okay, are two emotions that arise in that gap. These aren't exclusive or definitive, these are just examples. The gap between the world as it is and the world as you understand it to be produces confusion, perhaps frustration. This doesn't fit. And then this big root gap between who you are and who you think you are. This gap produces feelings of alienation and disconnection, disempowerment, lack of agency, lack of wholeness. Yeah, these are the root afflictions, really, that Buddhism is meeting. These feelings. You could even say that suffering is defined by the Buddha. You could also say it's a lack of wholeness, okay, because it's experienced as something missing, a lack, insufficiency. It's kind of how he defines dukkha, translated as suffering. So you could also say it's a lack of wholeness. And of course, these are overlapping, because the difference between the world as it is and the world as we want it to be, can be created from a misunderstanding of who you are. So there's definitely overlapping territory here. This also can manifest, and I'll be a little bit more focused, on this area, a gap between areas of your life that you're compartmentalizing, and you're trying to fit them together or balance them, but you're not rooted in the wholeness that includes them together, right? So we had a really nice example in our discussion session last week of a person's life koan he brought up was between the work and play parts of his life, right? And I think that's a really good koan that we all, experience potentially, this kind of discomfort in balancing these two things. And that's coming about through our desire to compartmentalize them to begin with. Now, granted, we need to look at the different domains in different areas, and there's logistical matters, that are different in one domain versus the other. There's no question about that. But for lacking the root engagement from that sense of wholeness, we get into trouble. And then it becomes a problem. So that's where it becomes a koan, when we start thinking, okay, well, do I need to work more? Do I need to work less? Do I not have enough play? Do I need to balance it? Okay? Usually these questions come up when we're feeling something. So it's actually kind of it's implicated. There's thoughts that go around, and then there's feelings that come around. So the feeling is you're exhausted, perhaps. So then the thought comes up, well, I'm working too much. And then that comes out, that generates the question, well, what do I do about that? Now I got to play more. Okay, and you're kind of off on this sort of analysis of how to fix your life and to take care of your exhaustion. So we'll talk a little bit more about this, but the way to deal with it with koan is to go right into the exhaustion. You go right into the exhaustion and feel it completely. Leave aside work, leave aside play, and then to see what arises from the intuition of that experience of exhaustion. And there's some mental visualization that can go along with this too. Here's a great koan about work and play, which I think I spoke about in January, my last talk before I went on sabbatical. I think I did. It's one of my favorite koans. Chosa chases the spring breezes. Some of you might remember it. One day, Master Chosa went for a walk in the mountains. When he returned to the gate, the head monk said, "Where have you been, Master?" Chosa said, "I was out walking about in the mountains." The head monk said, "Where did you go?" Chosa said, "First I went following the scented grass, then came back through the falling flowers." The head monk said, "It sounds very much like a spring mood." And Chosa said, "It's better than the autumn dew dropping on the lotus flower." There's some really rich symbolism in here, and I'm not going to go deeply into it. But just to bring out how this master is bringing up a koan of, I've got all these responsibilities, work responsibilities in the monastery that I lead, and I'm just out the back door, walking in the mountains through the wildflowers. He comes back, the head monk didn't even know where he went. Who knows how many sitting periods he missed or responsibilities he just kind of dropped. It doesn't really say that, but it does imply that the head monk is like, where the hell were you? And what does Chosa do? He doesn't defend himself. He doesn't explain himself, actually. He actually just answers the question. I was out walking through the fields. And the monk, maybe a little snarkily, says, "Oh, sounds like you're really full of spring there." And Chosa completely owns it. "Oh my God, I'm so full of spring. There's nothing better than this. I'm in this eternal spring. This is all that's needed, is this sense of spring." He also doesn't kind of shame or criticize the monk for like sort of giving him a guilt trip. He's like, it's okay, it's a good question. You know, you got your own relationship to work and play, but here's mine. Wholeness. Wholeness. When you walk in the mountains, walk in the mountains. When you're in the monastery, do your monastery work. No need to think about the other while you're doing the one. But we don't do that. This gap opens up between the two sides, you know, between the two things. Okay? And the gap manifests as, like I said before, it's usually some kind of dis-ease in the body, and then it's some kind of thought pattern in the head that problematizes the whole thing. Something's not right. I need to do something. I need to figure something out. I need to get back in balance. I need to answer this question that I don't have the answer to. So our normal body-mind habit patterns, when faced with this dharma that unfolds in body-mind, you know, appears in body-mind, is to try to analyze, control, resist, figure out, make go away these dharmas that are arising. This is the path to suffering. This is the path not to wholeness, but to fragmentation, alienation, and suffering. Right? So we go into the gap, into the feelings of the gap. The fear, the anxiety, the confusion. And we also experience the dharmas that are arising in the mind. Remember, thought is the sixth sense in Buddhism. So the thoughts and the words that come to you always are dharmas in the same way that a sound is a dharma or a sight is a dharma, right? Now, because it engages this neocortical executive mechanism of thought that we just ride to the skies, it's a very subtle and difficult dharma to truly work with, but we can work with it, right? We listen deeply to the words that we're telling ourselves and the words we're saying to ourselves, as well as the words we're saying to others. But the ones we're saying to ourselves tend to be more deeply connected, deeply. They come from a deeper place. Right? So listen to those words and feel the feelings. Allow that experience to move through you. I'm going to say a little bit more about that, what I mean by that. Let's see. I'm deciding whether to do a little bit of a side trip into the types of koans in our tradition. So I don't know if I want to do this or not. Let's see. I think I do. I want to share some. I'm not going to go all the way with this, but even those of you who are practicing koans most likely haven't gotten this kind of framework of koans that we have in our tradition. So I'm going to take a little bit of a detour, maybe 5 minutes, just to talk about the 5 types of traditional koans to give you a sense of the territory and how they work, okay, at a general sense. So there's 5 types of koans in our tradition. The first type is called a Hoshin koan. We call these Dharma body koans. And they're used to awaken the first insight into shunyata, or emptiness. They reveal the Dharmakaya, or the fundamental. Okay, they introduce the undifferentiated and the unconditional, the absolute, right? So the Joshu's Mu is considered a Hoshin koan. And a monk asked Master Joshu, does a dog have Buddha nature? Master Joshu answered, Mu. Okay. Another koan like this is a kind of a simpler one, is when an American sneezes, the English person catches cold. It points to the one body, the absolute. Okay, obviously doesn't make sense, but it points to that. All right, the second type is the Kikan koan, which is a dynamic action koan, and it helps us to understand the phenomenal world as seen from the awakened point of view. So it's actually the other direction. One is the absolute from the perspective of the relative, and this one is the relative from the perspective of the absolute. Okay, so an example of this is Master Joshu was asked, what is Buddha? And he replied, the cypress tree in the garden. Same master, similar question. First one, Mu, does not have. Second one, the cypress tree in the garden, quite particular. Can you see the difference? Yeah. Okay. The third koans are gonsen koans, explication of word koans. And they help us understand the sayings, not only of the old masters, but of all beings, I'm going to say. Help us understand what is coming through words in all situations. And they also show how the fundamental, okay, the absolute, while it isn't depending on words and can't be grasped by words, can be expressed. Something of it can be expressed in words without getting stuck. Okay? Really can be. So here's an example of that. I have a few examples of that. So two monks were having tea. One said, "It's a nice day today, but it's a little chilly." The other said, "Yeah, it's really warm." Which one was right? Which one was right? Okay, then oh my God, which one was right? Was it warm or cold? Which one was right? Yeah. And then we watch ourselves try to answer that way versus just go into warm, cold. Right? We see what gets stirred up by right, and we see what is the essence of warm and what is the essence of cold. You've all heard the, probably, the tale of Master Hui Neng and the two monks looking at the flag on the pole. So this is also a Gonshin koan. The wind was flapping a temple flag, and two monks started an argument. One said it was the flag that was flapping. The other said it was the wind that was flapping. They argued back and forth, and they couldn't reach a conclusion. Master Hui Neng comes up and says, "It's neither the wind that flaps nor the flag that flaps. It's your mind that flaps." The two monks were awestruck. Okay. Wind, flag, mind, flapping. There's power in these references. And if we orient ourselves to them in the right way, they can really produce this shift in our own consciousness of ourselves. You know, you could follow Hui Neng and say, "No flapping. Nothing flaps." That's just as good as it's your mind flapping. So I had a Gonshin koan that I've remembered for these 35 years, 30 years, 35 years. I was living in China for a year and I was teaching English. And I had a kind of a fellow who was a co-teacher, who's a Chinese, who taught at the school that I was teaching at. And he was kind of my guide. You know, he made sure everything was good with my, you know, my arrangements, and led me around. And one time he introduced me to a woman who I would say quite clearly was pregnant. And we kind of, we had an encounter, and then she went away. And I turned to him and I said, "Oh, you know, is she pregnant?" And he said, "Perhaps." And it really threw me. It's like, she was obviously pregnant, but his response was a koan, and I want to like really unpack it. It's like that answer was so much richer than him saying, "Yes, she's pregnant." It opened up all of these questions for me. It's like, well, Was she considering ending the pregnancy? Was it not okay to talk about the pregnancy? What might it mean for her to be pregnant? Maybe she was pregnant, but nobody else could talk about it. I mean, I was plunged into this kind of rich world of uncertainty around her pregnancy, but not only her pregnancy, but her life and Chinese culture and what was going on with him with that question, with that answer of perhaps. So I could practice with that, you know, if it were really deep for me, which, you know, it wasn't necessarily, but I was like, wow, what does that mean? Perhaps, like, what's going on there? Why would he say that? That's kind of how koans work. You really kind of go into the experience of what comes up for you. Okay. So the other two types of koans, I'm not going to go into much more. There's the nanto koans, which are difficult to pass koans. They create great doubt around any sort of attainment you've had to date around yourself. Cut right through that, even if it's a really deep understanding of yourself, like you've dropped away your personality structure. Does that mean anything? No. Ultimately. Okay. So to make sure that you don't hold on to anything there, you know, we have these nanto koans to make sure you're continuously not holding on to anything. And then the final types of koans are these goi koans, which are basically the 5 ranks of Tozan, as well as the 10 grave precepts, which we revisit as koans after, you know, practicing them and perhaps even taking them on in the Buddhist vows, you know, usually earlier in our practice, we take the precepts. Okay, so that was my detour into the types of koans, just to give you a little bit of a flavor on that. So now I'm going to come back and I'm going to conclude with some appreciation of what it means to feel the feelings that arise in the gap. When the dharma of the gap, the dharmas of the gap arise, thought streams and feelings, what type of quality of attention to bring to them, okay? So I want to talk about sequencing and completing. Okay? These terms come from my Dharma colleague and friend, Zenki, who I brought into the Zen Foundations class, you know, a few months ago. And he talks about it in this way, sequencing and completing. So completing sort of is a reference actually to Genjo Koan itself, Dogen's Genjo Koan, which is, you know, the koan of everyday life, which is kind of my text for this, you know, for this topic. But it actually, Genjo means to complete that which appears. And koan means the particular within the all-encompassing. So I want to bring in this concept of completing and sequencing. So when I say feel the feelings, experience the dharmas that arise within the gap, we have to feel them fully. We have to let them sequence through the body and reach some kind of completion place, right? And usually what we do is we bypass or we interfere with the dharmas that arise in the gap. The distress, the anxiety, the thought looping, whatever it is. And I talked about that earlier. We get in the way of them and we try to circumvent them or terminate them or control them, suppress them, okay? That does not allow for completion. It doesn't allow for sequencing and completion. To really sequence means to allow them to move through your body. The feelings to move through your body. They might even move to different parts of your body. They could move to different depths in your body. the textural and temperature gradient experience of the feelings could shift, right? You allow that type of feeling sequencing to happen. And you can also allow a thought process sequencing to happen. You could actually visualize what might happen if, so a certain koans of what do I do here? We all have these koans every day. What should I do here? Do I work or play? Do I yell at my child or not? What do I do here? You can actually do something in the way of kind of a thought experiment where you can put yourself in the position of a situation, or you can actually say the words that you're considering saying to somebody else, right? So you're sequencing a thought pattern in that way. Okay, it's a little different from sequencing the feeling pattern, okay? But altogether, it's about sequencing a dharma, the dharmas that arise. We have this traditional koan, which is how do you get out of the sealed tomb? So one thing you have to do is you have to put yourself in that sealed tomb. Right? You have to put yourself in there. So you're actually, following a kind of a sequence there. Okay, then what do I feel when I am in the sealed tomb? Okay, that's the sequencing that has to happen in order to work with that koan. Right? You do this in everyday life koans too. When you allow these sequencing to happen in the feeling and in the mind, then it's change, changes, change. Okay, dharmas unfold, dharmas unfold. You have to let the dharmas unfold. You can't get on top of them, suppress them, analyze them, control them, figure them out. Let the dharmas unfold in body, mind. Change, changes, change. And then something completes, something resolves. Right. And then you have some clarity opens up, and then some resolution opens up on the questions. It's like, oh, this is what I need to do. Yeah, this is how I need to answer this. This is what I need to say. This is what I need to not say. This is where I need to be quiet. Whatever it is. Yeah, so many. Okay, so this has been enjoyable. I've enjoyed this sharing with you on this, and I'm curious how it has landed for you. So let us sit.